All right, so this is once again notes towards a Metapoetics of Paranarratology 1, a 17-part reading, elaboration, and/or interpretation of David Antin's Varieties of Rhetorical Deception in Narrative and Non-Narrative Storytelling. And this is once again part 12, Danger, Deception, Delusion, Dramatikos, eironicus, Dramatikos, anagnoreikos, Daulis toward Delphi, and Donald's December declaration toward the destruction of democracy. And if you will recall, in this section, section 12, which for David Antin is segment 11 or section 11 of his piece, Varieties of Rhetorical Deception in Narrative and Non-Narrative Storytelling, but for us is section 12. We've been engaged with section 12 for quite some time. And there are a number of reasons for that, and we won't get into all of those reasons here. For fear of protracting section 12, even longer than it has already been protracted. But you will recall that we are now ready to engage David Antin's reading, elaboration, and interpretation of Act 1, Scene 3 of Aristophanes' The Smile of the Sphinx. And in this act, the character Tiresias has just left their engagement with King Laius and is embarking on a journey to the place of the Sphinx, to inform her of the circumstances of the future that were revealed in the three dreams that they had. So their purpose in meeting with the Sphinx is to engage her in the plot that they have formulated, both against Laius and against Oedipus, in order to preserve the health and well-being of the citizens of Thebes. And that, of course, that understanding and that interpretation, which David reveals here in his discourse, and you can tell, by the way that he's using his hands, there's a kind of revealing. We don't actually learn, until we see as an audience and hear and listen to the action that follows between in the dialogue and in the representations that are constructed in the intercourse between the Sphinx and Tiresias. But you could call this a kind of apocalyptic prolepsis, I suppose, on the part of David Antin's discourse here, where he reveals to us the intentions, right, of Tiresias before those intentions are actually revealed, through the dramatic exchanges, between these two characters. And that's only important because this is a metapoetics of Paranarratology, and being a metapoetics of Paranarratology, it's important to keep track of the organization of the materials of plot and the way that they're manipulated and collaged in space and time, as part of the account and the argument, right, that we want to present here, regarding the fact that narrative and storytelling never was and never will be a linear one-to-one correspondence between a series of events and the way that they're described and articulated, right, as representation in a telling, and that because of that, the characteristics of arrangement, if we want to return to the idea of a muse, of arrangement, we defined, such a muse earlier in this discussion and named her, Symphonia, and such a muse, bears upon the arrangement of, story, in terms of the articulation of the moments of plot as they're organized, arranged, and presented, through stratagems of, digression, analepsis, prolepsis, and additionally to the way that, they're laid out, in durations of time, and that segments of time are expanded or contracted or, lighted or repeated. And the repetition is interesting because, we see a certain amount of repetition in this particular scene, in scene 3 of Act 1, that we haven't seen before. Although there are transformations that we could refer to, the presentation of these elements that are repeated as something perhaps more like interpolations than repetitions, and the reason that these repetitions occur here is because Tiresias is a bit less deceptive with the Sphinx than they are with the character of Laius, and the reason for that should be obvious, and David points out. The entire purpose of engaging, the Sphinx in this discourse is to convince the Sphinx to perform these actions of destruction, as is her role as guardian of this road, into Thebes, but these acts of destruction, which Tiresias believes, and David uses the pronoun she here when he refers to Tiresias, but we'll use the pronoun they. Tiresias believes that they're performing the construction of this plot, against both Oedipus and Laius, to preserve, right, the health and welfare and integrity and well-being of all of the citizens and those individuals who belong to the city of Thebes, who are not defined by the Greek patriarchal terms of citizenship as the residents, all of the residents of Thebes, whether they are citizens or not, and in that sense, Tiresias is not just a spokesperson for those individuals who are defined sociopolitically as bearers of a certain kind of privilege, right? But by the place itself and the welfare and health of all those who live within it and work and practice and perform and live and love and make and act and think and exist. And so David brings all of this into the discourse, which is largely elaborative and interpretive, rather than observational, and it frames and situates our understanding, our being those of us who are engaged with his discourse and watching and listening to David's performance as a kind of a theater of talking. it presents all of this information, to us, prior, right, to the revelation, of the elements, right, that he describes and observes for us, because he presents to us. He's not presenting, David is not presenting the comedy, the smile of the Sphinx, and acting it out. And occasionally, he may use one of the voices of one of the characters, and occasionally we may, follow him in doing so. But largely, he tells us this story. So largely, this way of discoursing and narrating the story is a reification of the way that the story unfolds on the stage. He's not presenting it as a stage performance, and because he's presenting it as a verbal narrative, and that verbal narratives have certain conventions of telling and move around in time in different ways than the telling of a story does on the stage of comedy, it's necessarily a reification. And at this moment, David himself points that out and talks about the difference between the manner of telling, storytelling, and narrating in theater, in either tragedy or comedy, and in speaking, right, or if that speaking one imagines is written down on the pages of a book, right, that that narrating will take on elements, right, of the way that it would have existed if it were told by an oral storyteller. But there will be further distinctions that are perhaps only possible in the textuality of a narrated story. But an epic, David points out, as it appears on the page, is still closer to the way that discourse unfolds in an oral storytelling than the way that it does when it is presented on the stage. And so, David emphasizes and underscores here in his talking and discoursing how important it is, to recall and remember that his telling of this story is a reification of it. However much he attends to the details of the stage, it's still a reification of the telling that cannot create recreate the all of the levels of material detail that one would experience if one were there, watching this unfold on the Greek stage, or on some future stage, reconstructing this Aristophanean comedy, as it might be reconstructed in a theater of the absurd, or some kind of modernist or post-modernist experimental stage. And so having framed his inevitable, or one could say, using that favorite word of ours, that the ineluctable modality of failure, or the ineluctable obstacle, right, of discrepancy, or that ineluctable inevitability of a disjunction between the story as it's narrated in the artifact of the stage, and that story as it's re-narrated, through the piecing together of what we might refer to as the artifacts of memory, right? And the invariable, the ineluctable disjunction, between those two things. Having framed that inevitable, disjunction, then as a kind of, I guess, as a kind of apologia, as a kind of apology for the way that he moves around in time and omits certain elements and perhaps exaggerates other elements and presents them to us in this series of what one could say are always already by necessity permutations, right? And so narrative is always about permutation of story. If there was some abstract story that you could define, which of course there isn't, because every time it's retold, it's retold in a different way. But if there were some abstract, suppose that, David says, suppose that, and then he returns to the digression, which is a kind of framing. David was about to enter the story and explain the way that it was presented on the stage by Aristophanes. But then he got engaged in some of these other ideas and started digressing into, further elaboration and interpretation of his own, construction of the means, by which, through which a telling becomes permutation. And so he says, so imagine like in some kind of, imagine you have this proposition, right? Like in a Chomsky's transformational grammar, that there's like this original sentence behind whatever happens to that sentence, prior to its articulation in a particular space and time by a particular speaking subject. Imagine like that it has, in this Chomskyan way, right? This sentence has like this deep structure, and that structure is composed of, all these elements, including, this noun is and it's presented here, and then it's linked to this verb, and that's presented here, and then there's maybe another one of these, and then all of this gets hooked up together, and then if the speaker wants to make that sentence a passive sentence, then a grammatical transformation has to occur at this level, and if there's some subtextual operation that the sentence is transformed by, it has to occur at this level. Well, imagine that representation was the same way, and narrating had this relationship to this, like somewhere lurking in any narrating or any storytelling was this deep structure of the story itself, and this was like an immutable thing, right? And it had this grammar. And that you could, you could go there and you could articulate what it was. And you could say, this is the story of Oedipus, and it goes like this. And this is the first thing that happened. And then this happened. And this happened. And then this happened next. And it's put together in this way because it has this deep structure, right? And David says, but it doesn't work that way. It never worked that way. There was no, original, story. There's no original story of Oedipus that you can go back to and put your hand in that box and pull out the icon, right? The eikos. You can't go to that box and pull out the eikos of that story. Because it never existed. And there's no original score, David says. There never was an original score, for the image or the deep image of this story. But it's always put together. it's always, fashioned. In that sense, it's like, a dream, he says. He says, like the Greek word, for dream. The dreamer is the fashioner, right? And, he's referring to Morpheus. So, because you can't do that, it says, because you can't do that, it's important to understand that the reification, right? The reification that a storyteller performs in relationship to the elements of the plot is not only, is not only central to the activity of the storytelling, but is essential, to the revelation of that speaker's and that teller's relationship to the materials. And therefore, the organization of the materials, is part of that which lies at the heart of the significance of the story in relationship to my idea of narrative, right? And, if he says, like, if you could just reach in and pull out the story, and there was this, like, abstract story, and here's the sentence, and the sentence is, suppose the sentence is like, Mary, we've got to go somewhere. And you could just reach into this box and you could pull that sentence out, and it would have this meaning, right? And you could maybe tell it in different ways, and you could perform these transformations, like in a transformational grammar on the sentence, But that's not the way it works, because the story, doesn't belong to that statement. The story belongs to a context in which, the unfolding of the experiential values that belong to the subject and the actions that are performed, right, across, a number of durations of time in a number of different situations, right, come together and result in the emergence of this statement, which almost comes, out of nowhere, like the phantasms of Pandora's Pythos, right? And says, Mary, we've got to go somewhere. And so David says, so the narrator or the storyteller is really more of a juggler, than an unpacker of elements in a box, because the way that these elements, are put into play in the unfolding of the telling is part of the performance of the narrating and the narration. And it's not like, you open up a Christmas present, David says, or you open up a birthday present, David says. And maybe this present, has 3 elements, and you unwrap them, and you put one over here, and you put one over here, and you piece them together the way they're supposed to be pieced together, and then you have your train set. It's not like that. It's more like, decisions that you make about, how you're going to juggle this one over here, how you're going to juggle this piece over here, and how you're going to juggle that piece over there, and how you're going to, make that work. And if you add another piece, like, are you trained well enough, to throw a third or fourth or fifth ball into that juggling act? And if not, then you have to simplify your story. Like, maybe you have to leave out 2 of the Marys, he says. If you're not trained well enough to do that, or you haven't disciplined your mind, to remember and to keep track of which Mary did what, you might not be able to tell a story in which there were three Marys, and there's this confusion of which action belongs to which Mary. And there's a confusion about why they were named Mary in the first place. Or there's a confusion about that statement, Mary, we've got to go someplace. That maybe it meant something in Act 1 that it didn't mean in Act 2. And then, there's also, so imagine that narrating is juggling. And you have these balls. And you can only handle 3 balls. But you really need to introduce a 3rd character. Or 4th character, rather. David says 3rd character, and then he corrects himself. You have the 3 characters. You have the 3 characters named Mary. And you're juggling them just fine. But then you want to introduce a character whose name isn't Mary. And the reason that you want to introduce that character whose name isn't Mary is because you want to play out the confusion between the 3 balls that you're already juggling. Because what's the point, David says, of having 3 characters named Mary, who potentially can provide all of this confusion in a kind of comedy of errors if you don't play out the confusion? If you don't play out the confusion, like created by the 3 Marys, or in Aristophanes' case, and then you kind of spoiler alert prolepsis to Act 4, but having provided the spoiler alert prolepsis to Act 4, he says, or the 2 Dramatikoses in Aristophanes, the smile of the Sphinx. What's the point of having a Dramatikos eironicus and a Dramatikos anagnoreikos if you're not going to play out the confusion between the 2 characters, who happen to be twins? And whether and they have to be twins if they're on stage, David says, because that's how you experience them. That's how the narrative unfolds on stage, is visually, right? So unless you're like Tiresias and you can't see it, and someone's telling you the story, and then that telling becomes the way you experience the narrative, but it's very different than if you're seeing it for yourself, which is what Aristophanes is playing out with Tiresias in the first place. David says he's playing out the whole problem of seeing, seeing versus telling. They say show don't tell. Well, those show don't tell has a more significant relationship to narratology than just as a kind of grammar school or grade school creative writing advice, right? If you're talking about the materiality of the presentation, and you're talking significantly and seriously about the metaphysics of narrative, and not just trivially, he says, right? So what would be the point? What would be the point of Aristophanes introducing these characters, and then Dramatikos eironicus and Dramatikos anagnoreikos, if everybody knew what they were? And there was no involvement. There was no involvement in confusion. That's funny. Then you might as well not have 3 characters named Mary. So you're juggling these 3 balls, and each one of them is named Mary. And because you can see this on stage, that's symbolized by the fact that each one of the balls is red. Having 3 red balls is like having 3 characters named Mary. But then you want to introduce something else. You want to introduce. It's like the problem. David said it's like the problem when you're making that experimental film, with the serpent, with that green mamba, and you knew you only had 4 minutes and 33 seconds in which you could film that green mamba. But you wanted to put your film, you wanted to put your film in an installation, and you needed 4 hours and 33 minutes. And so you solved that problem by putting it on a loop, But then you became interested in the loop. And you wanted to try that loop in different ways. And you wanted to make it into a Mobius strip. But you couldn't, because you started out with Super 8 film. And it's only got a track on one side. And when you turn the film over and link it to the other side of the film in the Mobius strip kind of way that you have to do it to create that visual paradox, you can't do it. Because suddenly your film strip your film gets just derailed when it gets to the point that it's the loop. Well, it's the same thing with your 3 Marys. You got these 3 red balls, that represent your three Marys, and you want to create the confusion. You want to create the confusion between the Dramatikos eironicus and the Dramatikos anagnoreikos. Agnoreikos, David, pronounce these words, much better than I do. But you can't, because you can only juggle three balls. Well, it's the same thing with your Super 8 film. So you have to make a decision. Are you going to drop one of the balls, or are you going to practice your juggling until you can perform this with four balls? Or maybe you can just set one of the Marys aside. Or maybe at that point, you can drop all three balls, and you can have three new characters come in, and none of them are named Mary. And these three characters, could all be talking about the confusion, involved in the actions distributed across the naming of these three Marys. Or you could keep one of the red balls and you can introduce two characters, and that might be your best solution. But then you have to figure out some way that you can get those, two Marys back into the juggling routine, right? And that's part of the narratology too. Getting those two red balls back into the juggling. So if you don't know how to do that, and you're narrating, right? You're narrating the story, and you just drop those two red balls, those two Marys, and later, you want to pick them back up again because they come back into the plot. But you forgot, where they were, because your memory, or they rolled off stage, and so now someone in the audience is playing with one of those Marys, with one of those red balls. Well, you can nicely ask the audience member, and that might be funny if it's comedy. But if it's not comedy, or if it's something else, then there's not. In this case, it's comedy, or we wouldn't have the three Marys, David says. So then you can go to the audience and you can ask, and that's what improvisation is, David says, in a certain way, right? And so there's a certain amount of improvisation that comes into the play, but also, you got to keep track of your balls, and if you keep changing, it's more interesting if you keep changing the pattern, right? The pattern of the juggling than if you endlessly reproduce the same pattern. Like, say I endlessly reproduce the same pattern, I endlessly return to the same idea. That becomes boring. That's like the same pattern, right? Whether it's Mill's mess or Reginald's revenge, or whatever it is. He says he gets the name of the juggling routine wrong because he's not really a juggler, but that doesn't matter. He says whether it's Mill's mess or Reggie's revenge, it doesn't really matter. It gets boring after a while. So say say every discourse that I performed, was about the distinction between story and narrative. That would get boring. That'd be like an endless repetition of Mill's mess, right? And it's like, once I can do this, you're not that interested in it anymore. You want me to go on and do something else, right? That's why I never do that. That's why good performing, doesn't endlessly repeat the same performance, because there's pleasure in variety and change and surprise, and all that belongs to the plot of comedy. Or say that. Say that I endlessly, return to the same moment in the same tragedy, and discuss this meeting, between Laius and Oedipus at the Tripleus Moxitoas, the fork in the road, where destinies, play out their ineluctable, ends and courses. Say that this was, say this was the only moment in Greek tragedy that I was really concerned with, or that I really knew, or say, David says, or say, the only thing that I really knew about Greek tragedy, was what I remembered, from my reading of Aristotle. 'Aristotle. 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 I returned to this moment, endlessly, like, and played out, like this one routine from Mill's Mess or Reggie's Revenge or whatever it's called. He says, whatever it's called, doesn't make any difference. That would be boring. So you learn different routines. You learn Reggie's Revenge. You learn Mill's Mess. You learn Elijah's Elysian. You learn, you learn Lucy's Labrys, and you learn, Fiona's Fishing Basket. And that doesn't, absolve you, right, from the responsibility of, and the engagement in these improvisatory moments where, if one of your Marys rolls out into the audience, you ask, whoever picked her up, to return her, and you include that in your routine. He says, it doesn't absolve you of that, but, it's part of your responsibility, right, as a performer to do all of this and prepare in these ways, because it's not just your audience that changes, right? It's so that you could imagine that you had an entirely different audience every time you told the same story. Well, you maybe could imagine that you didn't need to learn all of these routines, or mix them up, maybe, he says, and he shrugs his shoulders. But maybe just to keep your own sanity, you would need to change and evolve, and tell different stories and develop different techniques, because just like what you want to do with that snake and the Mobius strip, you reach a dead end somewhere, and then you have to find a solution and pick up elsewhere. All right, so he says, so all of that going in. So let's get back to narrating the way this unfolds in Aristophanes. So Tiresias is on their way to have this conversation with the Sphinx, and David points out that once again the stage is split, like a split screen in cinema, and you have the same apparatus, you have the same device where the unfolding of the backdrop on the side, whichever side that is, left or right, upon which Tiresias is walking, is unfolding, and then the side upon which the Sphinx is sitting and resting on this pillar, and David describes the pillar. It's perhaps somewhere between 5 and 8 feet tall. It can't be too tall, David points out, because Tiresias and the Sphinx have to have this conversation, and he doesn't. David says he, and we say they. It would be awkward if they were on too different a level at this point in the story. Because he says, it's already comic, because they, and David says she, but she has to look up at her, and we can say, they, and in fact, in this instance, they is much clearer, because we're talking about two she's, like those two Marys, but they have to look up at their, and they can't see, right, and so they stumble. They stumble into the pillar itself, and he describes the pillar. It's ionic design, and David describes it because of his space-time location and his attempt to capture some of the details of the set. Whereas because we're so good with technology and have access to all of these materials, we can just do this and click on an open window. And it's basically, this pillar. It's a little taller than the one depicted on this plate. This Greek plate, but is it a plate? I think it's a plate. The circle, suggests that it's a plate. I suppose it could be a circle painted on some other object. I recall this image, very, very well, but for some reason I don't recall whether it's a plate or some other form of pottery. But this is basically the design. And as I mentioned, we don't have to describe it because we have access to this technology, and I can just David could have too, I suppose. He could have had a slide, and he could have had a slide projector in front of him and a screen behind him, and when he got to this point in his describing the narration, he could have said, slide please, and it could have come up, and this could be the depiction, and he could say, well, the Sphinx is basically sitting on this short ionic column, and then he could have pointed behind him back here to the location of the slide. It would be back here somewhere, and then this image would come up, and then he could return, and wouldn't have to describe it, but he does. He describes it, and he describes the height, and he describes the way that the Sphinx is situated on this ionic column, and with her head turned away to the audience, which will become important in the unfolding of the events and the action, and a certain kind of comical anagnoreikos as it unfolds shortly in the revelation of this telling of the meeting between Tiresias and the Sphinx, and so the unfolding backdrop on Tiresias' side, eventually stops unfolding, and just at that moment, of course, it matches up with whatever the backdrop is for the Sphinx sitting on her ionic, short ionic, column, and not anywhere near the size or the grandiosity of the ionic column that the Naxians provided, for the monument to the Sphinx at Delphi, and then if David had access to technology or a slide projector at that point, he could point back again to its appearance on the wall behind him, and saying nothing like this, and which he doesn't. He just mentions in passing that it's nothing of the size and grandiosity of that guardian Sphinx that was at one time situated at Delphi. We can, if I can click there and then give some demonstration of scale by panning back. Nothing this monumental or impressive, but again similar in design, the ionic columns, and like as I said, David doesn't do that, but he certainly could, and the technology isn't available for him, obviously, to click on something like the way it is for me today, but as we've constructed it, certainly the technology, to present, a slide, and to visualize, right, some of the elements of his telling, would have been available to him. But clearly one of the reasons that he doesn't do that is because this muse of David's Melite, you know, insists upon like the kind of simplicity of you know, the storyteller and the narrator, and David calls attention to it, you know, in this moment, and says, you notice, like, he says, you know, so I could have presented all of this, you know, with a slideshow, and then reveal it to you. And he expands his arms, and he says, reveal it to you in this way and visualize it. Yeah, but I chose not to. He says, you know, like, I've worked with technology before, and he talks about, you know, how he's an engineer and a mechanic, and, you know, he can do all of this stuff, but he chooses not to. He chooses not to by design. It's the same reason why I chose this, you know, black turtleneck sweater. He says, you know, because of the simplification. I don't want to, you know, wear a fancy costume or talk in too many voices. And you'll notice he says that, you know, there's not the wall behind me is completely blank. You know, there's no visual distraction, right? And David says, and you know, and I've even, you know, I even try to limit, you know, I try to, other than the movement of my hands, you know, and the movement of my head and the facial expressions that I make, you know, which all belong, you know, to the constraints, right? The constraints, you know, as articulated by the muse, you know, Melite, event, occurrence, meditation, thought, discourse. But other than all of that, you know, I even try to limit, you know, my movements. Sometimes I'll move back and forth, you know, shake my head one way or another, you know, provide, you know, motor signs as they're articulated in that essay by Roman Jakobson. You know, he says, but the simplification, you know, is there for a reason, and in Aristophanes, you know, it's quite different. It's quite different, and the difference, right? The difference in the materiality of the telling, you know, informs, you know, the structure of the tale and the unfolding in significant ways. You know, David says, and we never want to forget that, you know, and forget the difference between the simplification that I provide here, you know, and the complexities of the elaboration as they're theatricalized in Aristophanes. So this, you know, becomes a moment for him. The disparity or the distance between, you know, his you know, empty space, like this narrative being told in this vacuum in a certain way, like this abstract space, right? With this figure, you know, almost presented like as, you know, almost like this, you know, disembodied form. We wouldn't even see the stage that David is standing on. And David points this out. He says, you know, and he says once this becomes a YouTube video, you won't even see that I'm standing on a stage, right? You'll see below. You'll see the title, you know, of the piece or where it occurred. It'll maybe say something like, you know, David Antin lecture at Wexner Center for the Arts, but you won't even see the space in which I'm standing. All you'll see is this, you know, this white background. I might as well be standing in the clouds, like that other Aristophanes play, he says, you know, or in the ether. And then he gets into this, you know, discourse on ether and what that means in Greek, and, you know, all the different, you know, words for, vacuum, and it talks a little bit about you know, foreground and background, and I'm gonna, you know, skip over all of that because we're way behind. But he engages all of that, you know, before he returns, you know, to the unfolding of the story. And he says, but where we are is we're at that moment, you know, in which Tiresias arrives at the place of the Sphinx, and she's sitting on, you know, this 5 to 8 foot tall stone Ionic column. But her face, he says, her face is turned away from the audience, and we don't see her face. And he says, oh, there's a reason for that. And he says, because there's a surprise, and it's funny. And just as Tiresias arrives, they say, and then David says, she says, but we're going to say they say. They say, greetings. And this is in this moment. This is the moment where the Sphinx turns her face. And she doesn't turn her face to the audience completely, but she turns her face toward Tiresias. And you have to remember, in all of this, Tiresias is stumbling around because they're blind. He says she, but we'll say they. They're blind. And Tiresias is looking up a little bit, but not too far. Not as far as he would be looking up if this Sphinx were sitting on that grand column at Delphi, right? That the Naxians built for her, David says. And then David says he, but we'll say they. But they still have to look up, and it's kind of comical because they're straining their neck. And they're saying, and this is and she's turning her head. She's turning her head toward them. He says she, say they. And they say, and he says she, but we'll say they. And they say, greetings, Diarmenia, Sheshaponk. And then, and I can't remember, maybe David doesn't say, greetings, Diarmenia, Sheshaponk. Maybe David doesn't say Sheshaponk. He maybe says eironicos or eironicos, or I don't know. But the living image, right? Whether he says it in Egyptian or he says it in Greek, I can't remember. I think he says, greetings, Diarmenia, Sheshaponk. And as it's written in the Aristophanes, it's actually, greetings, Diarmenia, eironicos, the living image. And then Tiresias says, my wife, sends her best regards to her sister. And that gets a laugh, because what we see when the Sphinx turns her head toward Tiresias, and then when he says my wife, and then we'll correct David, when they say my wife, Diarmenia Sheshaponk, turns her head, toward the audience, and it becomes clear that the same actress or actor, if it was an actor playing the part of Diarmenia, it's the same actor. If it was an actress playing the part of Diarmenia, it's the same actress, plays the part of Diarmenia Sheshaponk, the Sphinx. And so this is a great surprise and gets a laugh. And she smiles, and then we're reminded of the smile that that she presents in that third dream, and that gets a laugh too. Just this big broad smile, and it's kind of shiny. He says it's kind of bright and shiny, and her smile, and he says that there's a technology that they had to accomplish that, and that's part of the humor as well, right? And it relates to the title, and that makes it funny as well. He says. So she's smiling at the audience, and it's this kind of direct address, and that's always funny too, and he's referred to her as Diarmenia Sheshaponk. All right, and then she returns the greeting, and she says, and she says it in this way, David says. She turns her head to Tiresias, away from the audience, and she says, "Greetings to they who are one more than most, but still fewer than many. For many, as they say in the mysteries, are the Thyrsus bearers, but few are the mystics, and fewer still are the caduceus bearers, whose works and words and wonders, through the divine grace of the muse, thaumaturgia, carry the warp and woof of our dreams across the threshold into our waking world. And David says, and she talks like this because she's the Sphinx, right? And riddles are enigma, right? Enigmata, enigma, and enigmata. Those are the Greek words for riddles. David says, those are her thing, right? And David uses the word enigma and enigmata at this point in narrating the story because he doesn't want to give away the gryphos. He doesn't want to give away the gryphos that comes up later in one of the dreams, which is kind of a pun and is funny, and that's kind of a spoiler alert right there on our part. So let's follow David and not give away the fishing basket, but he uses the word enigma. He says, like, enigma and enigmata are her thing. And so this is how she greets someone. And just in the greeting, there's already a riddle, right? So when she says, greeting to the one, greeting to they, who are one more than the many, right? Because the one of the many, David says most people are just one, right? It's like, I'm who I am, you're who you are, I'm a white male storyteller, you're a female member of my audience. And David's limited in his conception of the multiplicity and diversity that might represent the members of his audience or even himself. But we don't have to follow him there. But basically, like what he's trying to say is that in the greeting that Diarmenia Sheshapunk provides for Tiresias, she's recognizing that as a sacred hermaphrodite, they are two genders. And those two genders, are one more than the many, right? So the first part of the greeting, greeting to they, who are one more than the many, right? And the riddle is, the sacred hermaphrodite, right? Okay, so that's the first part, and she talks this way because that's her thing. Enigma and enigmata is her thing, and then again, David doesn't give away the gryphos at this point, like the alternative word for riddle, in Greece is gryphos. Is enigmata and gryphos. Like the Greeks have two words for stranger, but they mean two different things. But we're giving away too much. So let's go back. All right. So, and then the second part, you recall, already from the dreams of Tiresias, right? And the play, that Socrates was very fond of this particular line. And then later, this line, was adopted by Aristophanes, and then in this piece, right, in this piece we're talking about, and then it became part of the Phaedo, and Plato's reuse of it in the Phaedo, but originally it was this line. It was like, for many, as they say in the mysteries, are the Thyrsus bearers, but few are the mystics. And then David goes on, and he misquotes it, but we're not going to reiterate his misquotation of it. But we've already revealed the line as it's spoken in Aristophanes, so we don't really need to repeat it once again. So the point, David points out, the point in greeting Tiresias this way is that, Tiresias had greeted her, Diarmenia, with this term, that recognizes her relationship to the sacred Sheshapunk, the living image, right? That also that also refers to the way that she is situated on this stone column as the living image or the living stone, the image of the living stone, that refers, both to her role as icon, image, right, and sacred image, but also the way that sacred image is represented at Delphi, and the way that it is fashioned out of the materiality, right, of this Noxian stone, from which it was carved, and so he's referring, David says he, and we keep correcting him, but they. So what they're referring to, is both her image, her sacred image, and the way that she's situated, on this column, as a kind of, not throne, but in a certain way, how would you put it? As bearing this iconography that in a certain way is, even more important than the iconography of royalty, because of it represents this function that she has, within this, spiritual domain that belongs to the sacred, and so her greeting to Tiresias, basically does two things. It recognizes the sacred, and David says, her, when we say they, them, the sacred in them, and it does, so through references to these passages, that are familiar to the Greek audience from from their context in which they emerge, from the discourse of Socrates, but also, conjoined with, the way that she is a performer of enigma and enigmata, right? And David, continually uses that word, as I've mentioned, not the alternative word, gryphos, and that we in recounting, David's recounting of the story in some ways have spoiled for him, and the surprise that emerges in one of these dreams that Tiresias, narrates to Diarmenia and Sheshapon. Okay, so David talks about that and their exchange, and then continues narrating his understanding and his interpretation of the story, in which the Sphinx then inquires about her sister, and asks. She then asks Tiresias, how is my sister Diarmenia Hermeneuo? And then, of course, that also gets another laugh from the audience, most of whose members were perhaps not expecting the Sphinx and Diarmenia to be sisters, and in fact, twin sisters in a certain kind of way, surprised. There's David's look of surprise. Twin sisters, because their faces are identical. If their bodies are not, and then he shrugs his shoulders. If their bodies are not, and he shrugs his shoulders. But and again, if you wanted to construct this as a riddle, who is both my twin and is not my twin, because they look alike, and because they are twins, but also because Diarmenia doesn't take the form of that is Diarmenia Hermeneuo. This word is hard to say. It's hard to translate. Not translate. It's hard to articulate the familiar, right? The familiar word, hermeneutic, into this particular form, but hermeneuo, hermeneuo. It's hard to put that O on there for me. David doesn't have any problem with with this particular morphology. That's that belongs to us on our end of the narrating. But Still having trouble. Diarmenia hermeneuo doesn't take the form of a sphinx, right? So if one wanted to, and then returning to David, because none of those problems in pronunciation, belongs to his discourse. But returning to David's discourse, so if one wanted to articulate, the relationship between diarmenia sheshapank and diarmenia hermeneuo, one could say, who are both, twins and not twins, and then, open that kind of Duchampian, door that is, both open and closed. And David does, utilize that figure and mention the Marcel Duchampian door. He doesn't add all of those problems of pronunciation and reference the relationship between hermeneuo and that more familiar word hermeneutic. So returning, to David's, recounting elaboration and interpretation of the narrative as it unfolds on the stage in Aristophanes' The Smile of the Sphinx, then Tiresias, then says, well, she's fine, she's healthy and fine, and we're both, very happy, but I've come to you, for a very specific reason, and I have a request that bears upon, the future health and well-being of not only, your sister, Diarmenia hermeneuo, but all of the other, citizens and residents, because at this point, David, specifies and distinguishes between, what it means to be a citizen in Greece at this time and a resident or someone living, right, in Thebes, who obviously, is subject, to the same, conditions of health or lack, right, of health and the same devastations, right, that are initiated, by this future plague, whether one has a right, to claim, citizenship, within this residence and this particular domain or not, and so there's upon, not only, David repeats, what he was already articulated in the voice, he doesn't use a voice for it. He could come up with a voice for Tiresias, but he doesn't. He just presents it in this way, and he presents it in this abstract way once again because his muse is Melite, and he exists in this abstract space, and and the contrast between the black turtleneck and the white backdrop, and the minimal use of gestural significance in the movements of the hand, as opposed to more elaborate costuming, or the use of slides that don't exist back here but that could, all bears upon his relationship to this particular muse. So she's fine, David says, in speaking as Tiresias would speak, but not providing a voice for that character, just utilizing his own voice under the guidance of the muse Melite, and but speaking the lines that are provided by Aristophanes in the play. She's fine, but her future well-being, and then we've already articulated what he says, but we'll articulate it and reiterate it once again. But the future of her well-being, as well as the future of those who are both citizens and those who reside in the city of Thebes. And here David notes Diarmenia Sheshapank interrupts them, and David says interrupts her, but that makes the telling even more confusing, which may be his point, because he wants to performatively enact some of the humor in the recognitions and misunderstandings. But in any case, David says, at this point, Diarmenia Sheshapang, it interrupts them and says, wait a minute, did my sister, return, to our home, and is our, is Wasit, threatened, and that's funny, and the audience, laughs, because for a number of reasons, really. It may be less obvious. David points out to a contemporary audience the misrecognition here of Thebes as the Greek Thebes, and Thebes as the natal home of the Darmenian the two, let's put it this way, the two Diarmenias, who are twins and not twins, who the Greeks would have been aware at this time. David said, if you were a Greek and you were seeing this play by Aristophanes, you would know that that the reason that the Sphinx is confused by this is because the two Diarmenias were born in Wasit, which was the ancient Egyptian name for this city in Thebes, and or the city in Egypt, rather. That's my error, not David's. This city in Egypt, that the Greeks referred to as Thebes, and that we've come to call Thebes. And and for whatever reason, that she makes this mistake, perhaps because she's thinking about her. She knows, David says, she's not unaware that her sister is now residing in Thebes, the Greek Thebes, right? The Boeotian, Thebes, right? The Thebes in Boeotia, she knows. But maybe because she's thinking about her sister and their childhood together and how long it's been, since they've seen one another. She's thinking about, her natal home, and her natal home, happens to be this place that also is referred to as Thebes, just like, those three Marys, represented by those red balls that you have to decide which one you're going to put down if you're going to add another one of a different color in your juggling routine, right? And so it's a kind of funny moment, and it's funnier to a Greek audience than it is to us today. So if you were going to perform it today, you have to translate it, or you have to set it up in a different way, because your audience isn't familiar with the fact that these two twins, were born, in this city, that's called Thebes, or Wasit, as the Egyptians, used to refer to it. But now, they live in this city that's called Thebes, but it's a different city, right? So, for whatever reason, the Sphinx, gets this wrong, and she's imagining that her sister has returned to the Thebes that's represented, the Thebes that the Egyptians represented with this word Wasit, and in fact, Tiresias is referring to the Thebes in which both, and then David says he, but we say they and Diarmenia, currently reside. And of course, when he says Diarmenia, he's referring to Diarmenia Hermeneuo, not Diarmenia Sheshapang, to whom he's speaking, obviously. All right, so and first this confuses, David says, at first this confuses Tiresias. He's like, what are you talking about? And I don't know if you caught that, but he spreads his arms. What are you talking about? Let's go back so we can catch that. He spreads his arms a little bit there, and that gesture, falls. There you go. Well, we missed it. I think we missed it again. But it's an expressive gesture, but it still falls within the domain of melite. What are you talking about? I think we missed it a little bit, but there you go. What are you talking about? Okay, so Tiresias is, and then that gesture, that's enough. That's the subtlety of the gesture, and because we exist in this abstract space, and you don't have to you have to overdo it, right? So that's enough. What are you talking about? Tiresias says. And she says, well, you say, you said our city was threatened. He says, oh, you mean was it? You mean Thebes was it? No, I'm talking about Thebes, Boeotia, right? I'm talking about Thebes, Boeotia, not Thebes was it? And then she, oh, okay, so go on, and then Tiresias, continues to narrate the story. He says, well, I had these three dreams. I had these three dreams, Diomenia, and I told Diomenia, and then when David says he, but we say they, and then when they say I had these three dreams, I had these three dreams, Diomenia, and I told Diomenia, and then Diomenia Sheshabank, right? When after the second Diomenia, which confuses the first two, which confuses the Diomenias, right? In this, three Marys kind of way. At the second Diomenia Sheshabank, turns her head, once again toward the audience, and she gives that smile, and that bright, shiny smile that we're familiar with, and it gets a laugh. Obviously, David says, obviously it gets a laugh because it's funny, and so let's go back and then continue on. Well, I had these three dreams, Diomenia, and I told Diomenia about them, and then Diomenia turns her head once again away from the audience and back to Tiresias, and says, okay, well tell me about your dreams and then tell me about your plan. And the word that she uses for plan, David says, is the Greek word for plot, and that's important to the story. David says. All right, so at that point, Tiresias says, that's why I came here. But I think he says, I think that you have a better view of the dream, as it unfolds, if you were in a different location, and perhaps on a different platform, perhaps on a different column. Not that skimpy little column, not that skimpy little column that you're sitting on, but maybe something more like that column in Delphi. That's your namesake, and he uses the namesake. Again, that's your namesake, Diomenia Sheshabank, and then when David is using he, throughout all of this, but it's they, and when they say this, it's kind of a conflation. The language is kind of a conflation, because that is your namesake, Diomenia Sheshabank, means both, that is your namesake, and then they provide, her name, Diomenia Sheshabank, but it also is it also is means to refer to. That is it could have been stated this way: that is your namesake, Diomenia Sheshabank, with either that first Diomenia Sheshabank, being the reference, to her and addressing her, and then the second, Diomenia Sheshabank, being the reference to the name itself, but it conflates it with one. That is your namesake, Diomenia Sheshabank, but the line could have been, and David points this out. The line could have been, that is your namesake, Diomenia Sheshabank, Diomenia Sheshabank, right? And it's Sheshabank, not Sheshabank, and I mispronounced it incorrectly in a number of articulations of it here, but none of David's articulations mispronounced Diomenia Sheshabank. To be clear, and he's right. That it is a the use of the name, once, right? But implied, twice, is interesting and curious, especially in the unfolding of all of these dualities and doublings and repetitions of characters that give rise to all of this comedy of errors in various ways. So he says this, but perhaps you would have a better view, and then from the audience, in the same position within the audience, that diarmenia hermeneuo was situated when Tiresias, revealed the three dreams to her in Act 1, in Act 1 of Scene 1 of the story as it unfolds in Aristophanes. Then from that same location in the audience, and through the ingenious construction of some engineer, at least as brilliant, or perhaps not quite as brilliant as an engineer as David Antin, but a mechanical genius, nonetheless, has created this apparatus, inside the audience in which arises, right, this massive column of the scale and significance of the ionic column that the stone sphinx is rests upon at the temple of Delphi, and this column rises out of the audience in this way, and upon this column is situated another diarmenia, not diarmenia hermeneuo, but another diarmenia Shesapank, and this diarmenia Shesapank, and I'm pronouncing it more correctly here, perhaps because I'm slowing down a bit, but this diarmenia Shesapank is think about the ankh at the end of the name Sheshapunk as the ankh in the Egyptian word ankh, right? And then the pronunciation becomes easier, and the etymology perhaps becomes somewhat clearer. Sheshapunk, right? And that S in Sheshapunk is hard too, because the mouth wants to articulate it after the first sh that begins the sh. You want to articulate that sh again, and shesh ponk, but it's really shesepunk, So anyway, all of that going on, but that may defining it in terms of its transliteration, and transcription into the Roman alphabet, may help understand the etymological significance of that word. And that's an aside. David doesn't talk about that, but in any case, this column that appears to be stone arises from the audience, and upon it is sitting another diarmenia Shesapank, and she has a really great view of the dreams which are about to unfold, and that represent the figure of Tiresias, narrating them in order to enlighten Diarmenia Shesapank on the events that are going to unfold in the future of Thebes, and that is the Thebes Boeotia, not the Thebes Waset that was initially an example of confusion of one of these Marys, or one of these juggling tools, and And so, this Diomenia Shesapong, has a fantastic view of the dreams that are about to unfold, and the way they unfold, is very similar to the way they unfold in the last scene, in scene 2, in which the stage upon which now the figures of Tiresias and the Sphinx, that stage, is separated, and the two platforms upon which that she, is sitting upon her column, and they, are standing with their walking stick. That she, Diomenia Shesapong, seems perfectly aware is a symbol, both of Tiresias' blindness and stands in for, right, the caduceus that few, rather than many, hold and bear as their symbols and their destiny. All right, so the stages are moving, to the left and to the right, and David points out that it doesn't matter which side either of the characters are situated on, and it's a kind of comic moment. David points out he's moving up and down, because what the moving of maybe go back and do that again, with the gesture, the simple gesture under the direction of melite of the movement of the hands up and down represents here. Oh, did we miss it? We'll wait for it. There it goes. All right. What that represents is the fact that when the stage is dividing, and Tiresias is moving in one direction, and Diomenia Shesapong is moving in the other direction, then her little column, the ionic column upon which she's sitting, wobbles a bit, and she has to catch her balance, and that's funny, and that gets a laugh from the audience, obviously, and David then he points out, and the point is that she has this flimsy little column to rest on where she is, and later we'll see the importance of this vantage point from which she's watching the dream, and a promise that Tiresias makes to her if she fulfills this request of, and then David says hers, and of theirs, though the pronoun should be theirs, and if she fulfills this promise of theirs, then we'll see the results of that. And David doesn't want to spoil it too much for us, because part of the unfolding and the drama and the humor is revealed through the manner and the means by which the unfolding, that is the unfolding of the plot, occurs, the arrangement, right, the symphonia of it all. The symphonia of it all. All right, so Tiresias says, but you'll have a better view, from up here, and then what arises, out of the space, that's left between the figure of Tiresias and Diomenia Shesapong, who is and David reminds us, who, remember, is played by the same actress or actor, if it's played by an actor, that played the part of Diomenia Hermeneuo, and then of course because and David says and ideally, right? Ideally, if you could find a twin, for this actor or this actress, who plays the part of Diomenia Hermeneuo and Diomenia Shesapong, then perhaps this twin, this actress, who's a twin of the actress who plays the part of Diomenia Shesapong and Diomenia Hermeneuo, would be the the actor or actress that you would hire, for this role, sitting on this column, right? He says, well, that would be ideal, and he uses his hands to demonstrate that would be ideal, but it doesn't always work out that way. So he says, like Louis Buñuel in That Obscure Object of Desire, it can also be interesting if they don't match up, right? That could be interesting, or you could you could have them you could have one wear a mask, right? Like a very detailed realistic mask that represents this. But you could do it in a number of different ways, he says, and it could be funny in a lot of different ways. He says it doesn't always have to be funny in the same way. He says sometimes disparity can be funny, and sometimes homology and confusion can both arise out of identity and sameness and disparity, both. And it's important to remember that, and not get stuck on one thing. So now there are two Diarmenia Sheshapanks, one on one side of the stage, and one viewing the dream in the same manner that Diarmenia Hermeneuo, became the intended, right, the intended addressee of the revelation of the dreams of Tiresias in Act 1, scenes 1 through 3. Or sorry, that was my mistake. In Act 1, scene 1. Act 1, scene 1 contains all three of Tiresias' initial dreams. I don't know why I confused. The bijective function 1 2 3 1 2 3 intruded again in my understanding of or my remembering of the numerical values that we've assigned to in relationship to the three dreams in the first scene of the first act, right? So I meant to say the three dreams that are revealed to Diarmenia Hermeneuo in Act 1, scene 1 by Tiresias. All right, so clarifying where we are, we're still in Act 1, scene 3, and the stage that's arising between Tiresias and the Sphinx, the Sphinx that appears on the stage and not in the audience, not the Sphinx on the tall column, but the Sphinx on the little piddly column that was flopping around when the stage moved into two directions. What arises on that stage, belong to the representation of Tiresias' dream as Tiresias expresses it to Diarmenia Sheshapank, and it's the first dream as Tiresias expresses it here. David says is not the dream about the snakes. In fact, that whole bit, with the snakes and the caduceus and the relationship between the caduceus and the thyrsus and all that stuff and all the scopophilia and all of that. All that wish fulfillment material about not being blind and having the ability to see and perceive it with one's own eyes. All that wish fulfillment stuff and that anxiety of going blind again and the thunder and all of that stuff, that drops out. And Tiresias doesn't narrate any of that, and it doesn't appear on this platform. But what appears on the platform are the two characters that we're familiar with Oedipus and Laius, and that same split, stage design is there again, and it's unfolding in two directions. And the backdrop on Laius' side is moving in toward the backdrop that's unfolding on Oedipus' side, and Oedipus is skipping around with his club feet, and Laius is driving forward in his chariot. And none of the attendants are there. It's just Laius. It's just Laius, the king Laius, all on his own in his chariot, driving forward. toward the fork in the road, toward the tripleus of Moxitoas. And Oedipus is walking or running in the same way. And then those backdrops, they stop moving, and they match up, and then we know that they know that because of the way that the mechanics of the image and the moving background works, we know that they've encountered one another, that they're in the same space time, and the diarmenia. Shishapang, watching on the column is watching all this. But so is the other diamenia on the other side of the split stage. They're both watching. So you got two sphinxes, and they're both watching the same dream. And then when they meet, Leia says, "Get out of the road. Get out of the effing road," he says. But David doesn't say it that way. David says, "Get out of the fucking road. You're in my way. I'm a king. Can't you see by my crown I'm a king? Who the fuck are you that you're not a king and you don't have a crown and you're walking and you don't even have a chariot and you're standing in my way? Get out of the way." And Oedipus, of course, takes this the wrong way, and then they do this dance, and it's all very interesting. And members of the audience, typically David says, call out, circle, square, triangle, wave. And in the end, Oedipus kills Laius, and he keeps walking, and he walks, and in this one, he's on the opposite side of the side that the Sphinx is on, the side of Diarmenia Shishapang, not the one on the high column, but the one on the low column. So he has to cross. He crosses all the way over to her. And he says, "Hey, I'm on my way to Thebes. You know how to get there?" And at that point, she turns to the audience and she smiles, and then this big bright smile, that we've talked about before, like that Cheshire cat smile, like starts glowing, grows real bright, and then the lights fade, and then I'm going to break out. And David doesn't talk about how the lights fade in Greek theater and how this is anachronistic, and how this space, seems to be designed as a modern or avant-garde or experimental theater, but it's supposed to refer to Aristophanes. David doesn't talk about all that, but I imagine that it's one of these, what he refers to as domains of rhetorical deception, right? And that's how I imagine it. And it's left unstated. We brought it up here. We've kind of like exposed it. We've exposed it to the light, but it remains unstated, in David's description. So anyway, let's continue on. And okay, so the smile of the Sphinx is now generating this. He says, "Hey, the road Thebes." Of course, what's coming, because she belongs to the enigma and the enigmata. She's going to ask him, a riddle. And the smile glows, and then he the lights go out. David says, and then up rises the demos, which is it's the chorus, and once again it's in this circle, and Oedipus is in the middle of it, and he's walking, and he's still walking to Thebes. Not Thebes Wasit, Thebes Boeotia, Thebes Boeotia. He's still walking to Thebes, and he's about to enter the gates of Thebes. At least that's what we imagine from the way the fiction is, and the construct of the fiction is set up. And as soon as he stops, he enters, and then we see these figures, that represent the chorus and that represent the citizens and the residents, and and everyone who lives in Thebes, and we see that that they don't look well, that they're sick. And they moan, and they cry out, to Diarmenia, Sheshapang, and they say, Diarmenia, Sheshapang, David says, why did you let this stranger enter our city? Why did you allow him to bring plague and disease upon us? And they castigate her. They castigate her, and they reprimand her for her role, for her failure, right, to intervene and to halt, this future plague, and then the lights go out again, David says. And from whatever side they're on, Tiresias begins narrating again. And that was just the first dream, he says. But that's what David says. He says he. And then David says she again. Because David switches back and forth. She says, he says, she says, he says. But that was just the first dream, they say. And there were two more dreams, Diarmenia, they say. And as they're saying this, the platform, arises once again in the middle of the stage, and it's the same two characters. It's Laius once again, and Oedipus, but they're on opposite sides of the sides that they emerged on, in the first dream. And that's because the action unfolds in exactly the same way with the opposite result, and they go through the same movements, and members of the audience call out for the different kinds of dances and the relationships to the different muses that the dances provide signs and symbols for, and the only difference is the only difference that results is that this time it's Laius that kills Oedipus. And then when the stage lowers and returns, and the chorus once again complains and chastises and reprimands Diarmenia, Sheshapang, that what they complain about this time is that she let the king, she let Laius pass back into Thebes. And then, when the chorus is lowered, back into the floor of the stage, Tiresias says once again, but that's not it. That's not it, Diarmenia. There was a third dream. And all of those apparatuses go on again in the third dream, and the third dream, is very similar to at least to the last part, of the third dream, as Tiresias actually has it and narrates it, and as it unfolds in Act 1, Scene 1. Right? The main difference being that in this representation of the dream, the Sphinx isn't holding a labrys, and Diomenia Sheshapang is not holding a labrys and tossing it, back and forth between her right and her left hand. But and then because David hasn't spoiled it the way that we have, it has more impact in his retelling than it will in ours. But he says, but and he presses for it, but she's not holding a labrys. In this telling of the tale, what she's holding is a fishing basket. And then he says, and the Greek word for fishing basket is gryphos, right? He says, right? Like like the members of his audience at Wexner Center for the Arts know what a fishing basket is and how it's played out, in the comedy of Aristophanes and in other plays, by Aristophanes, and how it's Aristophanes who's the first Greek literary figure to use the word gryphos, to represent enigma and enigmata, and to refer to like the weaving or the fishing, the word fishing basket or weaving as a synonym, right, for riddle, right? But any case, but it's not a labrys, but it's a fishing basket, right? And so David says, so that tells Diomenia Sheshapang, how she's supposed to interpret these dreams, right? So her name is the interpreter, and then like the fact that she's holding this fishing basket and that she knows these literary references, like already like points in this metapoetic way to all these aspects of how like the riddle itself, right? The enigma itself is visualized on the stage, which is very different, from if I just say, I'm going to tell you a riddle, right? And so the telling of the story, like that visualizes and utilizes the material symbols and as puns, unfolds in a very different way than it would unfold, if it were just part of my narrative. And I have to go back and I have to identify each one of these objects and act like maybe like I'm acting like now, like that I'm holding a fishing basket in my hand and I'm passing it from one side to another. It's over here, like a juggler, right? So I'm juggling this fishing basket, and maybe today if one wanted to do it, because the Greeks weren't as fond of juggling as we are perhaps today, but if you wanted to do it, today you would have Diomenia Sheshapang on the stage, juggling, these fishing baskets, and maybe you wouldn't have, maybe she'd be doing the Mills Mass, or the Rodrigo Revenge, and he gets the name wrong again. But whatever she was doing, maybe you wouldn't have just the two baskets. Maybe you'd have three baskets, or maybe you'd even have four baskets. He said three baskets would be good, because she's the Sphinx and she likes to tell these riddles, in these three parts. So that'd be terrific. She said, like you should really have three baskets. Why she's tossing these two baskets? He said, let's rewrite it right now. Let's rewrite it for Aristophanes and say that instead of tossing these two baskets from hand to hand, she's juggling these three baskets, right? And that makes more sense because all of her riddles involve these three parts, right? And then David, gives it's kind of a spoiler, to a future dream. But he says all the dreams have three parts. Whatever the riddle is, it's the same form. All of her riddles, and it's kind of dumb. He says because she really knows one riddle, and then she just moves the elements of the plot of the riddle around. And he puts his hands up because he's a little exasperated by her riddles. Okay, so what's the one? And he goes, okay, so this is one of the riddles she tells. What has 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs in the afternoon, and 3 legs in the evening? Oh, that's an ordinary human, right? And then okay, here's another one. He goes, what has 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs in the afternoon, and 0 legs in the evening? And that's a king. And the reason is because he's carried around on a carriage or a platform, by his servants when he gets old and can't walk. He doesn't need one king. Okay, here's another one. he goes, what has 4 legs in the morning, 3 legs in the afternoon, and 2 legs in the evening. Okay, that's a dog, twice run over by a king's chariot, right? Each one has 3 parts, he says. Okay, here's another one. What has 16 legs in the morning, 6 legs in the afternoon, and zero legs in the evening or at night. He says at night. This one he says at night. It's like, that's a moth, right? Okay, and he goes, okay, so here's another one. What has 16 legs in the morning, 0 legs in the afternoon, and 6 legs at night? That's a butterfly. Okay, here's another one. What has 0 legs in the morning, 2 legs in the afternoon, 4 legs in the evening? That's a frog. Okay. And here's this is, David laughs when he says this one. He goes, "This one's my favorite." He goes, "This one's my absolute favorite." Okay, are you ready? What has 0 legs in the morning, 0 legs in the afternoon, and 0 legs in the evening? And what's the answer to this one? He says, like, not everybody get this one. This is probably the most interesting one, but it still has 3 parts. But it's interesting because it has 3 parts, but both parts are 0, 0, 0. But you can't say that it doesn't have parts just because all the answers are 0. It's still metamorphic, right? That way. And the fact that, okay, and I'm going to step out of this for just a little bit and digress into something. The fact that David probably gets the relationship between the 3 parts of the riddle and Aristotle's fascination with the number 3, and he probably gets the relationship to the Tripleus and Moxitois, right? But what he doesn't get is the relationship to Hecate at the crossroads, and the relationship to the divine feminine, and the 3 forms of the triple goddess, right? He doesn't get that, right? Although he gets some of the other stuff, but. All right, so then, stepping, out of that digression and back into the action of David's narratology. This is my favorite, this one. All right, okay. So, what has 0 legs in the morning, 0 legs in the afternoon, 0 legs in the evening? And then he's like, okay, are you ready? Are you ready? It's like an amoeba who doesn't understand cellular content and membrane displacement metaphorically. And that's pretty good. That's pretty good. Even though it's the same form, it has the same, 3 parts. All right, so he gives that away. So she's struggling with these fishing baskets, and her smile goes brighter and brighter, right? Just like it does in scene 1. And then the lights go out, and then there's this after image, on the retinas of all the members of the audience, and they see this smile, this Cheshire Cat style smile. And that relates, to the title of Aristophanes' story, and that's funny, of course, and everybody's laughing, and it's an interesting laughter because they're laughing at, if anybody were to walk in, right? David says, if anybody were to walk into this theater, this comedy, like they hadn't seen what the members of the audience just saw, and they didn't have this after image on their retinas, right? Their rods and their cones weren't experiencing this afterglow of the smile of the Sphinx. They wouldn't get what was funny. It would be invisible to them. It's only visible to them because they experienced the light of the smile of the Sphinx, and it's only interpretable to them. Because they've observed and listened to the unfolding of the plot the way that it happens. So if anybody were just to walk in on this scene, they wouldn't get it. Or Tiresias, because they're blind. And David says she, because she's blind. We say they, because they're blind. He wouldn't get it. So they're laughing, and then. And Tiresias, who's blind and doesn't get it, right? Like is like David says he, we say they can't look because they're blind, but they can look toward, right? They can look toward, and they can have an expression of confusion on their face, even though they can't look at the audience, but they look toward the audience, who's laughing, at this after image of the smile of the Sphinx, and they look confused. And they look confused because they don't get it, because they don't see it, because they don't see. And so they don't understand the laughter. And that's funny too. And that produces more laughter on the part of the audience, as well as on the part of the Sphinx, right? And the Sphinx, and the Sphinx, who's still on the platform, when the lights, come back on, but is being lowered down, is laughing too. So she's not only smiling, but she's also laughing. We can't see her, well, we can, if we look up, and depending on, what part of the audience you're in, you might be able to see her smile, or you might not. But you can see a little bit of a glow of a light, and then you called attention to that glow, by the fact that she's laughing. So you get it, right? And then she's lowered down, to the stage. And then, and then he says, to complete, that final dream, the chorus as the demos, comes back up, and at this point, he says the broken circle, but we can say the broken Ouroboros. The broken Ouroboros is repaired, by a stone figure, that represents the Sphinx, that is Diarmenia Sheshapunk, on her ionic column. And that stone figure, completes the broken circle, David says, but we can say broken Ouroboros. And then the audience, the audience, that's my mistake, that's not David's mistake. Then the chorus, sings her a song of praise and glory, right? And on all these, names that they provide her. These titles that are provided, in her name, that even exceed, the zonikos, or the zoikonos, or however you say living image in Greek, David says. Or you could just, you say it in Egyptian, he says, Sheshapunk, right? The living image, and then they give her all these additional titles, and you kind of understand that, like they've created this, this statue for her in honor of the fact that she saved them, from this plague, that is the result of this ritual contamination, the sacred contamination, breaking this taboo that occurs either way, that occurs if, and David, says here, instead of saying, Oedipus and Laius, he says, whether Ron DeSantis, defeats, Donald Trump, or whether Donald Trump defeats, Ron DeSantis, we're still plagued, we're still plagued here in the United States and in America by the destruction of democracy, and the rise of fascism, because they're both fascists, right? And he says, and in this period, between 2022, after Donald's declaration of the destruction of democracy in America, which might as well have been Ron DeSantis' declaration of the destruction of democracy in America, because they're both the same. The violation really isn't about a father killing a son or a son killing a father. It's about not respecting the institution of democracy and the Constitution. Right? Because right after, David says, right after he makes his declaration, that he's going to run for president, he says, and we can throw out the Constitution. We can throw the Constitution out the window because whatever I say, whatever delusion that I have in my head, supersedes the Constitution. Doesn't matter whether there's any evidence of whatever I say that my delusion is based on. There's no evidence. There's no information, that backs up any of my delusions whatsoever. But we can throw out the Constitution anyway, right? Because this is how I work, and then he returns to the performance of Aristophanes' play, as it would be presented on stage, and the audience is laughing, and the audience is laughing at the smile, that's an after image on their retinas, and the audience is laughing at. David says the second laughter depends upon on the occasion and occurrence of the first laughter, but it's practically guaranteed. But if it doesn't happen, you can plan some of the audience and you get them to start laughing, and then that explains, and then that'll explain Tiresias's weird looks at the audience. So you got to have like a few people planning the audience just in case the audience doesn't laugh at the afterglow of the smile of the Sphinx. You have to have a few individuals planning in the audience to start laughing, and maybe one of them can be Diarmenia, but in this case, not Diarmenia Chesapeake, but Diarmenia Hermenuo, Tiresias' wife, and she starts laughing, and then Tiresias, can look toward, because he can't look at, and David, once again uses he, probably because he's thinking about, probably in David's mind, when he's thinking about, and this is, digression, out of David's telling, but probably in David's mind, when he's thinking about Tiresias's relationship with Diarmenia Hermenuio, he uses, the male pronoun, because he's thinking about, a man and a woman, being married, and isn't as, not to say, that, David's, attitude is reactionary, in the same manner as the evangelical, Christians and the new rights, oppression of, anything, non-gender binary, but there is something about, the way that, sexuality is configured in David Antin's, narratives that, that remains, how to put it, relatively, more, binary and stable in terms of structuralist design, than we might want to imagine and present it, today. In any case, that's, speculative, and why he chooses, which pronoun at which, which occasion in the telling, is a matter of conjecture, right? But David says then, so you have this plant in the audience, and if no one's laughing at the after image, then then that plant starts laughing, and then that gives an excuse, for Tiresias to look toward, curiously, the audience, and look befuddled and confused, about the laughter, and then that will generate, the second condition under which, laughter arises, in that moment. And so the platform upon which that second Sphinx is has been observing, the narration of the dream as it unfolds has been lowered, and we're getting, the laughter of all of it, and the the circle, that's provided by the placement of this honorary, statue of Diarmenia Chesapeake, explains, in a certain way, the gratitude of the demos, and the healing, right? The completion of the circle also represents the healing. David doesn't mention that the Ouroboros is no longer broken, but he gets the idea of the healing circle, and all of that goes on, and then once all of the dream stages collapse, and we get and once the the reference to the the blindness of Tiresias, you know, is played with and played out, you know, with the afterglow of the smile and the confusion, you know, that Tiresias seems to have in relationship to the laughter of the audience. And once that's all over, you know, the space between the Sphinx, between, you know, Diarmenia, Sheshirpunk, and between Tiresias closes once again, and the Sphinx, you know, addresses Tiresias and says, so you want me to kill, you know, whoever survives this encounter? Is that what you're saying? And Tiresias says, yeah, that's you know, that's more or less the idea. And she says, you know, I have this thing about with the riddles, though, right? And Tiresias says, yeah, I have a solution to that. And she's like, well, what's the solution? You know, because, you know, I can't really go back on the riddles. This is like, okay, well, the solution is that like you have this idea, and this is why David's like throwing up his head. You have this idea that there's like one solution to each one of these riddles. That there's a bijective function that defines the relationship between the solution set for the riddle and the riddle that's being told, right? But your riddles each have 3 parts, right? And she's like, yeah. Okay, so your riddles have 3 parts, and that's symbolically important. And she says, yeah. And I get how it relates to the Tripleus of Moxitoris, and I get how it relates to, you know, the figure of Hecate at the crossroads. And she explains, David says, she explains that she gets all that, David says. And of course, you know, we would use the pronoun they. And but what about this? You know, so you don't, so that you don't violate your own rule, you know. You can imagine, right? You can imagine a series of riddles, you know, that didn't have, you know, like that each riddle, you know, rather than having each riddle, rather than having a bijective function, a one-to-one correspondence model, right, of a solution set, each riddle had 3 potential solution sets, right? And David doesn't, you know, give it away, you know, here, and you know, so I won't, you know, certainly, you know, give them away, but Tiresias, you know, provides examples of 3 riddles, each of which has 3 parts, and each of which make reference to, you know, morning, afternoon, and evening, and numbers of legs, or or the absence of numbers of legs, right? But each of which, you know, has 3 possible solutions. Like, so it wouldn't make really good, you know, SAT test questions or GRE test questions, right? Because, you know, because each of these riddles, like as they're reformulated, or they wouldn't make great crossword puzzle questions either, because there's not a bijective relationship. There's not a bijective function that defines the relationship between the solution and the riddle. Now, each riddle, you know, branches into 3 parts, just like, and this is where the Sphinx really starts to get excited. He says, now you've got 3 parts to your riddle, but the solution set, right, for each one of these riddles is like a Tripleus of Moxitoris all over again. And the Sphinx smiles at this, and she smiles, and then that glow, you know, that glow that we're familiar with, you know, starts to shine, and she turns toward the audience, and this gets a big laugh, because we understand, right? Like, and And David gets why it's funny, but he doesn't, get the depth of it as much as a Greek might, understanding like the whole relationship to Hecate and the triple goddess and everything like that, and all the parabases and border crossings and how they relate to these different domains of underworlds, and all of that stuff that we keep in our mind, and a Greek, in the audience would have kept in his or her or their mind, but that is a bit beyond the way David is reconstructing the story, because he hasn't understood the Othisi, the Analepsy, and the Anavasi. But he still thinks it's funny. And the smile of Sphinx, she's smiling, and she's like really liking this idea of these three solution sets to each one of the riddles, right? And he said, and then Tiresias says, so then, whether they get it wrong or they get it right, it doesn't really matter, because you've got these three solution sets, and he says you can look at it in a number of different ways. You can look at it this way. Well, you can say that's not the solution set that I was thinking of at the time, right? And that can be your excuse, for killing this guy. Or you can think of it this way. You can think, well, that's a good solution set for this context, but that's not the context in which I'm telling this riddle. Or he says, you can think of it this way. Well, that's one solution set, but really there are three solution sets, and you only got one, and you were supposed to get all three, right? Because you didn't get the significance. You never got. You completely failed to get the deep meaning of the significance of the tripleus amoxitoas, and therefore you got it wrong, right? He says, so Tiresias says, so there's a number of ways to justify that they got the wrong answer, either one of them. And she says, that's a good solution. And then they say, so we have a deal. And she says, the deal is that you'll erect a ionic column in my honor, just like they have at Delphi. And they say, yeah, if I do this, you'll erect one of those, not a 5 to 8 foot column like the one I'm sitting on, right? And he says, David says he here, but we've been saying they. And they say, no, just like at Delphi, out of that Naxosian marble, that really tall one. That just like that. And she says, okay, then I think we have a deal.